Hi everyone, welcome back to Winging It. My name's Rebecca. If you're new here, you're very welcome, and if you're a regular, welcome back. Now we're towards the end of October, and October is a 5-Sunday month, and as in previous months we are going to use our 5th week to explore a technique. If you were watching last Sunday in our live stream, you'll have seen us making Dorset buttons, and I have added an extra video just with a clearer demonstration of how to make a Dorset button. We're going to use some of those techniques today to make a sampler page. As I was researching Dorset buttons, I discovered that traditional button making is a whole world that we can play around with. So I'm going to show you a few more button making techniques, and I also want to look at some other ways to trim and decorate and edge your work. This is just the beginning of a massive topic that we could spend all year on if we wanted to. So this is just a taster session to give you an idea of some of the techniques that are out there. I've put a list of everything you're going to need in the description below, and I've put links to some of the tools and resources that I'm using. So gather all your bits and pieces and let's get stitching. If you were watching on Sunday, you will have seen the chaos as I made Dorset buttons for our slow stitch sampler, and I've been planning this panel for quite a long time. I was going to initially just do trims and edges, but I thought there were so many variations of these buttons that I thought we could make a page that echoes that slow stitch panel that we made last week and create some more variations on the Dorset button. Now I have put up a video that goes through this in a much more controlled way, so there's a tutorial for this exact button. I make it in a sort of beige where we make a standard Dorset button, and there are loads of tips for how to get that really even scalloped edge. So that's one that I have already made, and I thought in this video I'm going to show you a couple of other variations, a couple of other stitch buttons that you could try, and then we're going to work on some decorative edge stitches as well. So this is just going to be almost like a sampler page of different techniques, which I think might be quite nice because we've done pictures and abstract things all the way along. This one is just going to be like a sampler. The first one I want to show you is a bouquet Dorset button, and so the starting point of this is exactly the same as a standard Dorset button. So I've got my ring here, I've blanket stitched all the way around the edge, and I've turned those ridges, that ridge that is created by the blanket stitches, to the back, just like I'm making a standard Dorset button. So I hope you can see that ridge there. I'm just trying to tuck it away. Now what we're going to make here is a Dorset button that looks like a bunch of flowers, and we approach this next stage in a slightly different way. So I've got my thread, I've got it threaded into my blunt tapestry needle, and so what we're going to do first is lay our spokes. So just as we've done with previous Dorset buttons, I'm going to bring my thread down the back so that it crosses the centre of my ring, and then I'm going to bring it up again so that it's in line. I've got two, trying to get the angle right to show you. So I've got two spokes there, one going down the back of the ring and one coming up the front, and I want them to line up. Now I'm going to come back down the centre again, so now I've got two spokes at the back and one at the front, and I'm going to come to exactly the same place at the bottom of the ring, but this time I'm going to take my next spoke up at a slight angle off to the side there, and then I'm going to come back down to the centre point, and I'm going to space it evenly, but I'm going to go to the other side of that centre spoke, back to the centre again, and now I'm going to go back off to the left, back to the centre and off to the right, and I think I'm going to try and get one more. So I'm always coming back to the centre point each time I create a spoke, and I create this sort of fan there and you'll notice that this time my spokes do actually sit behind each other. Now, just like I've done before, I want to anchor those spokes, so I'm bringing my thread around the bottom of my button there, and I'm going to take it down just inside that space on the right hand side and pull it through. And now I'm going to bring it back up, keeping tension on the thread all the time. I'm going to bring it back up on the other side in that last space, and I want to pull it through so that it's nice and tight. Now what we're going to do first is create almost like a stem, or I suppose you could think of it like a tree trunk, and we're going to do that by just wrapping all of the threads together. So I'm just going to work through this space here and this space here, and the key is to keep tension all the time. So I'm taking my needle down through on the right hand side and back up on the left, and we're just going to wrap all those spokes together at the bottom, and this is going to do two things. First of all, it's going to create the stem of our bouquet of flowers, but it's also going to stop these spokes from slipping and sort of working their way out to the side. Now the trick to this is to try and get your wraps sitting next to each other rather than sitting on top of each other. So we're just working up that stem each time. I want it nice and tight, so I'm trying to keep as much tension on this thread as I possibly can. Now you can choose how far up you want to come with this one. Now I don't want it to come up very far, so I think, let's see what this one looks like. I think I'm just going to go one more, and that'll do. We want to create some fabric, and that's what we've done on all our Dorset buttons. Our weaving creates a sort of fabric that we can work on. And so this time I just want to create almost like a standard weave. So I've taken my thread down on that right hand side, so effectively I've gone over this spoke here. So what I'm going to do is come up in between that right hand spoke and the next one along, like that, and then I'm going to go down through the next spoke in that space. So we're not back stitching this time like we did to create our spider's web wheel. We're just weaving up and down in between the spokes. So I'm going over one spoke and then under the next spoke, keeping tension all the time, and then down at the outside edge like that. Now I don't want to pull it too tight because I don't want to distort, but I just want to make sure that my thread is sitting flat and doesn't have lots of lumps and bumps in it. So now we're going to reverse that process. So I've gone over that one. This time I'm going to go under it, over the next one, under, over, under, over, and then under the last one, and bring it up, and then we go back the other way. So over, under, over, under, over, under, over. And we just want to keep packing down our stitches each time so that they're nice and tight together. And we just carry on that process until we have filled up that fan. I do have a whole video on weaving techniques, and I will link it in a card at the top of the screen. I'm almost out of thread, and my fan is now meeting the corners, and so I'm just going to weave back to the centre, and then on the back of my button I'm going to take my needle down inside the weaving along that spoke and just bring it out on the back there, and then I can trim off that thread. There's my little fan arrangement there. You can see the woven texture. So now we're ready for our next step. I have a sharp needle here threaded up with some sort of beige thread, and I'm going to do exactly what I've just done and bring my thread underneath the weaving on the back, just to anchor that thread in place, and that saves us having knots on the back of our button. So I'm just going to pull it until the end of the thread disappears inside the weaving, and all I'm going to do is add some French knots. So I'm going to stitch through that weave that I've created, and I want to be really careful that I don't pull too hard and pull my thread out. And I'm going to create a French knot. Now I've got a whole video on knots and I'll link it at the top of the screen there, just so that you can learn this slowly if you want to. But just very quickly, I'm going to point my needle away from myself. I'm going to wrap over the top of the needle twice, holding it in place with my finger, and then I'm going to catch a thread and take my needle back down just slightly away from where I brought it out. And when I pull through, I have a little French knot on the surface, and I'm just going to keep repeating that, adding as many French knots as I want to create my bouquet of flowers. Now you could also do this with beads if you want to. You could use a variegated thread. I'm going to add some different colours shortly, but I thought we could just start off with some cream flowers. And French knots look a little bit like teeny tiny roses, so that makes a really nice arrangement. And when you want to finish off, you can just slide your thread through the back there again, like that, and trim it off. So I'm going to put some more French knot flowers in, and then I'll come back and show you the finished piece. So there's my Dorset button bouquet with some French knots added, and that can sit alongside my standard Dorset button. You could also add a scalloped edge around that, but I'm just going to leave it as it is. Now there's a variation of the bouquet, and that is a tree. I've part done this one, so you can see I've started it in exactly the same way. I've put in my radiating spokes and I've stitched in my stem, but this time, rather than weaving, I have wrapped along the spokes, and where I have wanted extra branches, I've taken my thread off to the side and made an extra spoke. So I just wanted to show you how I'm doing that. And I'm going to work along this spoke here. So I've got some new thread. I'd actually run out of thread, so it was a good opportunity to pause. And I'm going to stitch that up the trunk. So I've got a sharp needle again here, and I'm just pulling that through the trunk just to anchor my thread in place. I just want the thread end to disappear inside there, and then I'm going to start by just wrapping around this spoke that's coming up the centre here. Now you could use wool for this. You could, a slightly fluffier thread would hide the wraps more effectively, but I'm just going to leave it at this. You can also come back and double wrap if you want to, particularly lower down where the branches would be thicker on a tree. Now I've come part of the way up, I am going to take a little branch off to the side. So I've just taken my thread up to the edge there, and I'm bringing it back down, and I'm going to carry on wrapping, and I just want to catch that spoke in place. So I'm just going in between that new branch that I've just created, and when I pull that down it just will anchor it in place, and then I can carry on wrapping up that main spoke. And I think it might be nice to have another little branch coming off and crossing over what we've already got. So I'm just going to take my thread through, and I want these starting by going backwards, so I'm just going to, what's going to look good, I don't want it too far over, so let's pop it there, and again I'm going to take my thread back down and then up inside that V that I just created to anchor it in place, and I can work my way back on that main spoke again, working my way to the edge. Now when I'm at the edge I want to wrap this branch as well, so I'm just going to slide my needle through those blanket stitches at the outside edge. Remember I've turned my ridge so that it's on the back. It does slide round, so you just have to keep adjusting it, and then I want to slide underneath those blanket stitches so that I am coming out at the next branch that I want to wrap, and then I can work my way back down that branch. And now I want to wrap this one, so I'm going to take my needle through the wraps on this spoke a little way to anchor the thread. I don't want knots, so if you can get it all the way down to the V where the branch began, that's great. If not, you can always stop your thread and restart. Okay, all the way back down. So now I'm going to wrap this branch here. So now I can work my way back down my next branch, and I want to make the tree as natural looking as possible. So what I don't want is all my branches fanning off evenly from the base of the trunk. So what I'm going to do at this point is start joining up this spoke with the next one along, and this will create a little bit more of a thicker branch and will vary the angles that the branches are disappearing off from the trunk in. Every now and again I'm just letting my needle hang loose because we are constantly twisting it here and we want it to not tangle too much. It's those twists that create noose knots. Now I'm back down to the bottom. I can start wrapping my next branch, and I'm going to do something similar with this one just to make sure the branches are coming off in a sort of organic way rather than all joined together. So this one is all about just mixing it up and not doing the same thing too much before you change and start doing something slightly different. So you get the idea. I'm going to just finish off these last few branches and then we'll come back. There's my tree, and that can be added to my page of Dorset buttons. The next one I want to show you is called a bird's eye button, and these are really cute. They're actually quite robust, they're not hugely flexible, and these were traditionally used on shirt sleeves. So this is a way of making a button with nothing other than thread. So all the buttons we've made so far have been made with a ring, but this one is just thread only. The size of your button depends on what you wrap it around. This one was wrapped around a pen, and that leaves quite a large hole in the centre, and I used the narrower end of my seam ripper for that one, and I'm going to make one that is really quite tight, I'm hoping. I'm just going to do it like I did before, and I'm going to use this narrower end of my seam ripper. So I'm going to start by holding the end onto the seam ripper there, and I'm going to catch that end in as I go, and I'm just going to wrap the thread That's 20 wraps, and I think that will be enough. So now, really carefully, I don't want to lose that hole in the centre. I'm going to slide those wraps off the seam ripper, and I want to sort of pinch that bundle between my finger and thumb, and before I lose it, I'm just going to take my needle through the very centre of those wraps and create a blanket stitch. So I've just taken my needle through the loop that I've created, and I'm going to pull it really tight, and that will secure them, and you should just be able to see there that there's a hole at the centre, and that's the hole where the seam ripper was, but it's the hole we're going to use every time. So all I do now is just surround this little bundle of wraps with blanket stitches, and I'm pulling them really tight each time, so the hole will get clearer as I go. So just like we have used a metal ring, this time we're creating a ring out of wrapped thread. Always through the centre, through the loop we've created, and pull really tight. And once you've got about a quarter of the way round, your button really starts to take shape. I know it doesn't look like much right now, but bear with it, because it will start looking much more like it's supposed to. And the tighter you pull it, the more robust your button will be. So ideally we want it so tight that you can't squash it between your finger and thumb. If you're struggling to see the hole at the centre, just take your needle through and just ease those threads around, and hopefully you'll be able to see that hole there. So I'm just going to work my way around now, making blanket stitches that sit right next to each other, so it's worth taking your time to make sure your blanket stitches are heading exactly where you need them to be. You don't want them to get caught further round and leave a gap. You want them sitting right next to each other around these loops. It might be really tempting to hold your button like this as you're stitching it so that you can see the hole better, but actually what will happen is your button will go out of shape and distort. So you get a much better finish if you hold it flat. and you might notice that you are getting a bit of a bulge. Don't worry, it will all come right if you just keep going and make sure your blanket stitches are sitting right next to each other and are pulled super tight. So there I am all the way back around, and we've got our little bird's eye button, and just before you finish your thread you can just give it a bit of a squash and a squeeze and make sure it's nicely where it should be, and then I'm just going to take my needle through the button like that, and snip it off. And that's my little bird's eye button. The next one I want to show you is called a death's head button, and this is a wrapped button. This one's my first attempt and it's not perfect. I learnt quite a lot in the process of making this. It's a button that creates its own shank on the back, so it's automatically got something that you can use to thread it onto a garment. What we need is a post in the back of the button as we wrap it. I've done lots of trial and error with this. I'm going to use a needle, and I've found a nifty way of putting a hole in. I could only find solid wooden discs that don't have a hole, and so I've had to play around quite a lot to work out how to do this. The first thing I need to do is mark the quarter points on my button. So I've just got my circle template here, and I'm putting markers at the quarter marker points. I want to be fairly accurate with this, and this is going to guide the front of my button. This won't be seen, so you don't need to worry too much about making marks. My circle template's got the quarters already marked on it, so it makes it really easy. And then I'm just going to join up those markers to make a cross on the front of my button. Now before I go any further, I need to make the surface of my button tacky, and the best way to do this is with beeswax. This is just a beeswax block. You can pick them up really easily. You could do this with an old beeswax candle if you have one, and I'm just going to rub it onto the surface on all sides. I want to get the edge as well, and this is going to help my thread stay put. If you can't find beeswax, another thing that you could use is Copydex. I haven't used it for years. I saw it for sale in the range a few weeks ago, and it just reminded me how useful it is. Copydex is a contact adhesive, so you paint it onto your surface and let it dry, and then if you paint a second surface and let that dry, when you press the two glued sides together, that's when the bond forms. But if you do it on just one surface, you're going to create a non-permanent adhesive tack that will stick the button on. So that is a good alternative if you don't want to use beeswax. So now I need to make a hole for my needle to go into. If you can find button formers that have got holes, I'd love to know where you get them from, because I can't find them anywhere. I've just got my seam ripper here, and I'm just going to work it through at the centre point of the cross that I made, and I'm just sort of twisting it backwards and forwards. The wood gives enough resistance that it's not going to poke out the other side and stab you in the finger, so I'm just working it gently but firmly backwards and forwards until I can just feel it starting to poke through. I don't know if you can see that, it's just lifted the wood a little bit there, so I know where the centre is on the back, because I need that cross on the front. And I am going to use a fairly thick needle and just line it up with where that little dimple is, where the seam ripper pushed through, and I'm going to work that needle into the back of the button so that it stays quite firmly in place. Eventually our threads are going to hold it in, but just as we're getting started, I just want to know that that needle isn't going anywhere. I'm just pushing it down on my table a little bit just to make sure it's really in there. And we're pretty much ready to go now. I've got some variegated thread. I've seen some beautiful variegated thread buttons and I wanted to give it a whirl. And I'm going to start by pressing the end of my thread into the beeswax on the back. And it's not a permanent fix, but you can see it holds on there quite well. I'm using my thread straight off the skein, so you can do this with any thread. You don't need to cut a length. So I'm bringing it down under the button, and I'm always going to wrap from bottom to top, and so I'm bringing it under the button, up to the top, over that halfway mark that we put in place. And then I'm going to do that again, but this time to the right of that first wrap, then to the left, then to the right again, and then to the left. And I want my thread nice and tight, I don't want it baggy. I can just use my nails to just push those together, and I've got 5 bars there now. My needle's just dropped out. No problem, I'll just pop it back in there before we go any further. So there's my 5 bars across that centre. So now I'm going to make a quarter turn so that those bars are now horizontal, and draw my thread across the back just like that to the bottom of the other halfway mark. And I'm going to repeat that process again. So I'm taking my thread up across the centre and then just making sure that it's lined up with that centre line. Then I'm going to the right of it, then to the left of it, then to the right of it, and then to the left of it again. So I've got now 5 posts going across my button, north, south and east, west. The key with this one is to keep tension all the time, so you can see I'm keeping that thread really tight. So now I'm going to take my button another quarter turn clockwise so that my crisscross is now an X, and I want to take my thread inside the bottom right hand line of that X so that the thread just hooks into the inside of the cross, and I want to take it vertically up to the inside of that top bar of the cross. Then I'm going to do a quarter turn. I want my thread on the back to go to the right of my post all the time, and I'm going to repeat that process again. So hook it around the inside of the bottom right of the cross, take it up to the top right, quarter turn, and repeat that again. So bottom right of the cross, top right of the cross, quarter turn, and again hook it in to the bottom right of the cross, take it up to the top right. So now my post is trapped inside the wraps on the back. That's eventually going to form our shank, and I've made this sort of lattice work on the front. And now I just keep repeating that process. I'm always working to the inside of the previous wrap, and then I turn my button a quarter turn each time. And if you've got a thread that's just looped over or in the wrong place, you can just adjust it as you go. It is worth doing adjustments as you go. But you can see I just turn my button a quarter turn and just keep wrapping round and round and round until my button is completely wrapped. So my needle is just poking forward a little bit there, so it's causing a little bit of distortion. I'm just adjusting that, and I reckon I'm going to get maybe 1 more on each side, and I'm just making sure my new wraps are sitting in between the wraps that I've already done, and that's my last wrap, and that essentially is the death's head button. I absolutely love the effect of that variegated thread there. So we've pretty much done. We've just got to finish off now and make sure that doesn't come unwrapped. So I'm just going to put it face down while I thread my needle. I've just cut off the thread there, just threading that up into a needle, and I just want to almost like tie that off at the back. So I'm just going to slide my needle underneath those wraps as close to the wooden disc as I can, and take the thread through that shank that I've created at the back. Just unthreaded my needle there, and then I'm going to take it back across the other direction. So I just keep crossing backwards and forwards. I've got a thread that's gone awry there, so I'm just going to lift it back into place. That will be secured when I've finished tying off the thread. So I'm just going to add a few more stitches working across that shank and pulling the thread as tight as I can to make sure everything that I've wrapped onto the button is held in place. So a few more stitches backwards and forwards. When you're sure that everything's secure, you can take your needle out and then just add a couple more stitches so that you can knot off the thread that you're using. So I'm just taking it through there, and this time I'm going to go through the loop and pull tight, and then just do that once more to create a knot. And then I can trim off my thread quite close to the button, and there's my death's head. Absolutely love that. Much better finish than the first one. So there we go. That's two different versions, one with just one colour of thread and the other one with a variegated thread. So we've looked at quite a number of buttons now. I want to turn our attention to some edging and trim techniques. So we're going to look at fringing, and I've started off by drawing a line along the bottom part of my felt there, and I've marked every ½ centimetre. I'm going to stitch along that in back stitch. There's my back stitch in place. If you're not sure about back stitch, I've got a tutorial. I'll link that at the top of the screen. So what we're going to do is thread loops through each stitch, and I've just doubled over my thread there to create a bit of a loop, and I'm going to bring back my trusty seam ripper, and what I'm going to do is slide my seam ripper under the stitch, hook on my loop and then pull it back through, and just make sure I've got some working thread there. Then I fold the loop back over the two ends and pull the ends through that loop. So I'm looping it around the stitch, a little bit like a wire loop that we made in our weaving video. And that's basically it. I'm just going to repeat that over and over and over again. I'm going to try and create a sort of random arrangement of colours. So again, I'm sliding my seam ripper under the stitch, hooking on my loop and pulling it through. Fold the loop over and pull the two ends through the loop, and when I pull tight, that hooks it around the stitch and holds it in place. I'll just show you that once more. Slide my seam ripper underneath the stitch, hook it through, fold the loop over the top and then pull the two ends through the loop, pull the ends and pull it tight. And you just repeat that as many times as you like. So I'm coming in with another colour now, and if you have a crochet hook to hand or even a hook threader, that might be a little bit easier. I can't find mine at the minute, so I'm just using what I had to hand. You could do it with a needle even. If you've got a very blunt darning needle, you could thread the loop through the eye and just pull it through that way. So it's quite repetitive. If you want to use a thicker thread, you'll get more coverage. I think I'm going to go for 2 loops on each stitch on this fringe, but we just keep repeating that process. So that's all my threads on. I've gone for a very random arrangement, and like I said, I've got 2 loops on each stitch. So now I'm going to do a bit of jiggery pokery. I'm just lifting up the fringe here and sliding my cutting mat underneath, and I just want to straighten that out a little bit, just smooth it so that the threads are all roughly at the same tension. And then I'm going to get my quilting ruler over the top. I'm just lining it up with that top line on my cutting mat. You can see I've cut a couple already over on the right hand side there, just to give me a sense of how long I want it. And then I just run my rotary cutter across, and that trims them all to the same length. Clear away all the bits, and that's my fringe. Now you could cut this in a decorative way, you could cut a wave into it, make it up and down, or do it straight across like I've done. And that's a fringe. Now I've just drawn another line there because I want to show you another edging stitch that you can add. We're going to do a blanket stitch. I want to keep this really shallow though. So I've marked every ½ centimetre, and I'm just going to make it a really shallow blanket stitch at each marker. So it's hardly even got a vertical. And every 3rd stitch we are going to add something extra. I'm going to add a picot. I'm going to do this as a bullion knot. So I'm going to, where my blanket stitch is, I'm going to take my needle back through the fabric like that, and I'm going to put some wraps. That's 15 wraps I've put on there. And I've counted them because I want the same number of wraps on every stitch. So I've got, this is a straw needle, so it should be fairly easy to pull through like that. So I'm pulling my thread through, like that, and I'm going to take my needle back through where that thread came out, so all back in the same point, and I'm going to keep pulling it through until it's nice and tight, and that gives us a little picot. So now I'm going to come out at the same point again, but inside my previous blanket stitch. So I hope you can see there where my needle's coming out, just inside that blanket stitch. And I'm going to carry on and put another 2 blanket stitches, and because I'm putting blanket stitches over the top of that picot, it will help it to stay flat. If you were working this at the very edge of a piece of fabric, these picots would sit below the edge. So this is where I'm going to put my picot. So I'm going to go back through around that blanket stitch, catch a tiny amount of fabric, and then I'm doing 15 wraps. Make sure those wraps are tight on my needle. If you're not sure about bullion knots, they appear in my knots video that we did back in April, I believe, and I take you through bullion knots in that video in a really slow and easy to see way. So if you're not seeing these very clearly, then just head over to that video. I'll put a card at the top of the screen. So again, I'm coming up just inside my blanket stitch, and I carry on. So you get the idea. I'm going to stitch along the rest of that line and then we'll come back. So here's how my page is looking so far. I just wanted to show you another little thing that you can do to add embellishments to your work. I am going to use a ruler to do this. So you need some thread in a colour of your choice. You can do more than one colour. I think I'm going to do multiple colours, and I'm going to just wrap my thread around my ruler. So this is 5 centimetres wide, this ruler. You can make these any size you like. We're going to make a tassel. So I'm just going to wrap with my first colour, and then let's get some of the mint green in. And I quite like this beige as well. So you can do as many wraps as you like. It really doesn't matter, it will just change how bulky your tassel is, how full it is, and then you need to decide what colour you want to hang it from. So I'm going to use this red. I've just got my awl here. I'm just going to lift up that pack of threads and I'm going to tie a knot. Like that, and I want it to be really tight, so I'm just going to put a second knot in there and then a third knot just to be sure, and now I can slide this off my ruler just very gently like that. So I'm just going to spread out my loop like that, and then I'm going to lay it flat, and I want another length of my red thread, and I'm going to lay that down, and I want to lay my loops just so that the red thread is a little way down from the top, about a centimetre down from the top. And again, I'm going to tie a knot. And before you pull it tight, just make sure you've positioned it as you want it. So we want this as tight as we can get it. I'm going to do a second knot, and then I'm going to turn the tassel over, just make sure all these loose bits are out of the way, and I'm going to tie a knot on the other side as well. So this is just an overhand knot, like that. And then if you want to, you can tuck, in fact, let me just show you. So if you want those thread ends out of the way, if you just thread them into a needle and slide them behind that knot that you just tied, they'll go down on the inside rather than sticking out at a funny angle on the surface. So pull that really tight. I quite like the way the head of that looks with the three colours coming out there. So all I do now is cut at the bottom end, so I'm pulling that quite tight with my scissors and just cutting along the threads like that. I'm going to bring my cutting mat back, work out how long I want my tassel to be, so I certainly don't want it any shorter than the shortest thread, and I'm holding my, you can do this with a pair of scissors, but if you've got a rotary cutter you just get a really nice finish, and I'm taking my rotary cutter across. Now if you want to, you can get a comb in there and you can sort of break up the threads a little bit. It's really good if you use 6-stranded threads because they separate out really nicely. I've got a lovely multicolour tassel there. And that can sit nicely from the corner of my page. I'm probably going to add it so that it sticks out at the bottom like that. So there's a tassel. You can wrap that more if you want to. You can do different combinations of colours. That looks really nice wherever you put it. So the last thing I want to show you is a beaded tassel. So this is great for the corners of pages, and we've done a thread tassel there. I want to show you one with beads. So I've just got a normal thread, I've got a fine-ish needle. I've just knotted my thread and brought it up from the back, and I want to just thread on some beads. I want to keep this fairly random. So there's my tassel, and I want a largish bead for the end. I've got this large white pearl bead for the end, and so I'm going to thread that on at the end. That's how it's going to look, and then I want to come back up my string of beads with my needle. So this is where it really matters that you've got a needle that your beads will go through, because now you've got thread and the needle passing through them. All the way back up like that, and so when you pull that tight, you won't see the thread at all. Just taking it back through the back of my fabric, and there's a little beaded tassel that hangs loose. So I'll just show you that again. I'm coming out, make these slightly different lengths. So let's put on some beads that match our threads that we've used. And I think I'm going to have a slightly less giant bead on the end of this one. So I've got a smaller pearl like that, and then I can come back up my string of beads. Like that. Go back through your fabric where your thread came out, and as you pull it tight, that will create your little beaded tassel. And might be a good idea to just knot it off on the back every now and again, just to make sure you don't lose everything if your bead should fall off. So that's beaded tassels. I'm going to make a few more of these and stitch down my buttons, and then I'll come back and show you the finished panel. So here's my finished page. I've got my array of handmade buttons, I've got my beaded fringe, I've got my bullion knot picot there, and I've got my fringed edging, and I've also attached my tassel so that it's going to hang outside the book when the bucket is complete, and it's also sort of at the centre, so I could use that as a way of closing the book as well if I wanted to. So that's our trims, buttons, trims and edges page. I hope you have enjoyed some of those processes. I can't wait to see what you create and what you favour out of all of these different edging techniques. This is just a drop in the ocean of all of the different handmade buttons and edging and trims that you can create, but I hope you've enjoyed this taster into the world of handmade buttons, trims and edges. So looking forward to seeing what you make. Do post your pages at #FSHWingingIt, and so that we can see all of these pieces together, you could also add #FSHWingingIt44. Please do give us a like if you've enjoyed this video. It helps other people find our projects, and if you want to do something else that is a new technique, I will put a video here. I'll put a video here that's best for you, and if you want to subscribe, click on our logo down here, and that makes it really easy for you. Have a great week, happy crafting, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!